I no longer ever read newspapers, having them only in the house because they've been donated to me as something to start my fire with. And it's the same with television. On the rare occasions that I do watch a telly, usually at a friend's house, it takes me no more than 10 minutes to remember why I ditched it in the first place. But there are a few small, very small advantages in consuming the mainstream. Last Saturday I drove 15 miles to go to a railway station, only to discover that there was a train strike. I'd have known that if I'd read the newspapers. But by way of compensation, one of the interesting things about my being immersed in the culture wars on the internet as a result is that you do come across things from overseas that you wouldn't otherwise hear about. Things that I just wouldn't be fed from the legacy media. Sometimes these are little snippets of good news that would either just be missed in the melee or that the established media would actively prevent me from seeing. Either because it would be assumed that I, as a British citizen, would not be interested in, or that it would be undesirable for me to know. And an example of this is the phenomenon of the country and western song Try That in a Small Town by the artist Jason Aldean, and the ham-fisted woke attempt to cancel it, which resulted in it going straight to the top of the charts. Although I've always been a bit of a heavy rock or metal fan, which is a hangover from my teenage years when I was, like everyone else, desperate to fit in, I have of late been rather rocked out. Partly it is because I'm not really interested enough in music to seek out what I like, and partly because heavy rock has never been particularly accessible. The radio never plays it. But it's also partly I've been exposed to and become more amenable to country music generally. My work colleague has a digital site radio, and he tends to play the British country music station Smooth Country. And I find that as I get older, I like it more and more. Ever since the 1980 film The Blues Brothers, which was basically a vehicle to showcase the director John Landis's favourite type of music, country music was considered a bit of a joke. In it, a hapless country band, inevitably named the Good Old Boys, were repeatedly the butt of the joke. But without wanting to sound too conservative, perish the thought, there is something reassuringly, something wholesome about it, which I suppose was why Landis took the piss so much in the Blues Brothers. Compared to James Brown, John Lee Hooker, Ray Charles, and my very first exposure to the sensation that was Aretha Franklin, at the time, it did seem, well, a little pedestrian. In hindsight, I think that Landis's treatment of the Good Old Boys was more of a gentle tease than a real disrespect, but that's a topic for another time. Maybe it's just my advancing years, but that wholesomeness becomes more attractive the more you hear it. The simple notions of love, family, hometown, working the land, horses, patriotism, God, and even pickup trucks seem more vital by their absence with every passing day. And perhaps not pickup trucks, but you get my drift. And anyway, country wouldn't be country if they started waxing lyrical about Land Rovers rather than Chevys and Fords. But by liking country music, you inevitably come to identify with the people who make it. So who are these people? Well, they are country people, as in rural, or at least rural adjacent, like those from small and perhaps mid-sized towns, far away from the huge cities on the American coasts. What's needed is an umbrella term to describe who we mean. And we do have one. Rednecks. Remember the film Mississippi Burning? It was a great film, wasn't it? At least I remember it being great. For anybody who doesn't know, Mississippi Burning was loosely based, very loosely as it turned out, on the efforts by the heroic FBI to find and convict the murderers of 3 civil rights volunteers, James Chaney, Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, who had gone missing in Mississippi in 1964 organising a registry of black voters. The outrage over their murders, it has been said, provided the final push for President Johnson to sign the Civil Rights Act, which effectively ended the unofficial but effective segregation of the Jim Crow laws that had existed since the end of the American Civil War in 1865. So why was it great? Well, for lots of reasons, not least for its cinematography, for which it won an Oscar, along with all the other categories in which it was nominated, including the acting of Gene Hackman, Willem Dafoe, and particularly of Frances McDormand. But those are the reasons the critic liked it. I liked it because of the atmosphere, the sense of slowly rising tensions in the oppressive southern heat, an ambience that has also been employed in Ralph Nason's more contemporary 1970 offering, Tick, 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 as well as the more recent Aussie flick, Mystery Road. That sense that something is about to boil over, something that everybody knows is coming, but that nobody can stop. But I remember clearly as to why I thought it was a good film. I remember that clear as day. It was seeing the brutal, ignorant, backwards racists, as portrayed in comic book fashion by Michael Rooker, get their comeuppance. There was a catharsis to that, particularly when one of the suspects gets beaten up by righteous tough guy Gene Hackman in a barber shop after having battered his own wife for speaking to the FBI. And that stayed with me for a while, reinforcing my own sense of moral superiority that I was also on the side of the good guys. The racists had been beaten, and deservedly so. That problem, after the signing of the Civil Rights Act, was now no more. I now know that, like in so many areas, I was being manipulated to a degree by people with an agenda, even if that agenda was being driven ahead by people with genuine good intentions, perhaps like Alan Parker, the British director, who can't really have known the whole truth of the matter. In my defence, I was probably only 22 when I saw it. I'm not saying the moral centre of the story was misguided. It wasn't. But things are never as simple as they are portrayed. As McDormand's character says, people look at us and only see bigots and racists. Hatred isn't something you're born with. It gets taught. And we have to remember that the film was made in 1988 and portrayed the FBI as the heroes of the story. Due to recent events, only an idiot or an establishment politician with something to hide could ever see them that way now. But were they better then? In 1964, the FBI still had J. Edgar Hoover at the helm, a man who spent so much of his time attempting to discredit the most peaceful but also the most effective figure in the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King. Portraying Hoover as a good guy is almost as ridiculous as portraying Anthony Fauci as one. But the point is, acceptable society now had villains they could point to and say, you see, we're not like them. We're not like the rednecks. And this, it seems, is important. Depressingly, all societies seem to feel the need to have figures they can point to and hate. Sometimes this is easy, and sometimes it is even justified. Certainly from the moral standpoint of today, slavery should be something we can point to and hate, as should Jim Crow segregation. In South Africa, whites continue to feel the backlash of 46 years of apartheid. 30 years after its abolition, the majority black government continues to treat the memory of Nelson Mandela as if he was merely their most useful idiot on their path to racial justice, which is in effect nothing more just than revenge. The idea of appropriation, that of confiscating the private property, mainly land, without compensation, of whites is gaining ground. One wonders when the revenge will be satisfied. In another 16 years perhaps, when the abolition of apartheid will have lasted as long as its adoption. Or will it go on longer than that? Will there be any whites left in South Africa in 2040? Will there even be a South Africa by then? So how long will it be for rednecks to be forgiven for slavery, Jim Crow and racism? How long will it be until they are no longer smeared with that brush? The history books tell us Jim Crow lasted for 99 years, and it ended 59 years ago, 13 years longer than apartheid was in force in South Africa. Now, I'm conscious that I'm wading into something about which I only have a second-hand and cursory knowledge of. It's been over 20 years since I visited that part of the world, and although I went there frequently and worked with many Southerners, I am not an American, let alone a Southerner, and cannot claim to know about that society in any real depth. Although the point I'm edging towards is that, despite being neither an American nor a Southerner, I am, in some real sense, also a redneck. I am part of a tribe that has been routinely mocked, traduced and demonised as being thick, ignorant, low information, backward, unsophisticated, tribal, bigoted and, of course, racist. I am a Brexiteer, and although Brexit has not genuinely been delivered as promised, the desire for it is still very much there. Brexiteers are British rednecks, and like their American counterparts, Brexiteers are largely the people who do all the work, the people who run the trains and the buses and keep the streetlights on and the roads maintained and the telephones connected and the food delivered. Brexiteers are not, on the whole, part of the laptop class. France has its rednecks too, in the form of the yellow vests. Canada has rednecks who probably occupy much of the same ground as the Americans, but were most visible during the truckers' protest. Australia has its tradies. The farmers of Holland and Ireland are also rednecks. These are people who work outside, in the real world. They are the ones who know how to do stuff, practical stuff, stuff that the laptop class rely on. And unlike the laptop class, they are the ones who can be relied upon to show up with the correct tools to help out when the shit hits the fan. And so, slowly but surely, as it appears to me from my vantage point on the opposite side of the Atlantic Ocean, there has been a resurrection in the perceived value, if not quite yet the esteem, of the redneck. And of course I'm using that word, redneck, in a somewhat ironic way. It used to be pejorative, didn't it? An insult. It certainly seemed to be last time I was there, although there was a self-deprecating use of it even then, by characters who could be described thus. In some ways it seems the word has been reclaimed, in a way not dissimilar to that of the N-word by African Americans. And with that resurrection comes with it a resurrection in the perceived value of the places that such people come from, the small towns in the so-called flyover states that no self-respecting coastal metropolitan would be seen dead in. The small towns that they would, ironically, be far safer in. The small towns as referenced by Aldine in his now chart-topping song. And it's heartening to hear, as a 55-year-old, it's heartening to hear such basic human decency being celebrated, and celebrated in the face of the self-righteous hostility of cancel culture, and coming out on top. But, and there's always a but, the United States, like most countries in the West, is an overwhelmingly urbanised society. It wouldn't be as rich and powerful if it wasn't. My country, despite being the very oldest industrial society on earth, still imagines itself to be a rural one. It's been well over 2 centuries since my green and pleasant land started to be transformed by the dark satanic mills of the world's original industrial revolution. But the self-image of a bucolic and agrarian realm remains potent in our national psyche. And just like Britain, somewhere in the region of 80 to 90% of Americans live in urban centres, cities and large towns, despite self-projecting as rugged frontiersmen. Because concealed beneath the righteous message of good old boys raised up right, there is an acknowledgement that 80 to 90% of America is already lost The shit that flies in the city is flying where 90% of Americans live. To borrow another Western trope, this really is the last chance saloon. The ghoulish, predatory, anti-human barbarians who paint themselves as progressive sophisticates have taken over education, the arts, social services, healthcare, the justice system, the courts, the prisons, city and town planning, the sciences, environmentalism, the police, agriculture, private firms and corporations, including even banks, politics, the military, whole nations and supranational bodies like the EU, and now having even captured the majority of the cities of the United States, and with them 90% of its population, they are now knocking on the doors of the small towns of America, of the gun owners, of the rednecks. After that, there is literally nowhere else to go. For the globalists, there are no further nuts to crack. Once American gun owners are eliminated, whatever that might mean, it really is game over. Nevertheless, that still is quite the nut. There are, it seems, over 77 million registered gun owners in the United States, which must mean there are 20 to 30 million urban gun owners. So that nut isn't just a rural one. On a recent trip to the English West Country, I visited Salisbury Cathedral. Whilst there, I wanted to have a look at one of the 4 copies in existence of the Magna Carta, upon which much of Western civilization is based. As I stood there in the artificial semi-darkness designed to protect it, I looked long and hard at those tiny, almost incomprehensible words scribed upon it, and tried to absorb the value within them. I knew that what I was looking at was generally regarded to be the most valuable thing that I would ever see. But it wasn't. As the COVID hysteria has made plain to anyone with a functioning neural cortex, words do not matter. Constitutions, bills of rights, long-established laws, principles, codes of conduct, ethics, or even the Magna Carta were utterly ineffectual in the face of malevolent and determined power, either coming from big pharma, governments, the censorship industrial complex, the intelligence agency, big tech, or billionaire computer salesmen. All of those things that we thought would protect us, folded like the paper and the ancient parchment that they are. Every single protection we thought we had was steamrolled under the public health juggernaut. Every check was unchecked. Every balancing principle was unbalanced and then overturned with barely an acknowledgement of its existence. If one talks to an English lawyer, as I often do, they will probably say that the Magna Carta has no legal force anymore, that its articles have been overridden and subsumed by the mountain of statute law that has superseded it in the intervening 8 centuries. That may be true. But what also appears to be true is that the Magna Carta is as flimsy philosophically as it is in reality. The establishment rag the New York Times' famous tagline is the laughable "Democracy dies in darkness." But the reality is that democracy and free societies, like the Magna Carta itself, can just as easily die in the full glare of sunlight. Because that is what is happening. The Magna Carta is not, as I fondly believed it to be, at all valuable. And neither is the Bill of Rights of 1689. The same is true of the American Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, and the US Bill of Rights. Of equal value, it seems, is the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the equivalent constitutions of Ireland, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, Austria, New Zealand, or anywhere else in the so-called free world are not worth the paper that they are written on if not enough people defend them. Our societies have been so degraded that the things that are most valuable are not, as should be the case, the lofty ideals that built them: freedom of speech, the rule of law, presumed innocence, equality before the law, the right to privacy, but the cold, hard reality of force and, crucially, the ability to resist it. Words have proven no match for that. We need to rely on something more tangible.